When you're first getting into web development, one of the first things you learn how to do is fetch data from a third-party API. It's pretty common and actually really good idea to make your app publicly accessible so you can use it as a portfolio piece. When using a third-party API, you also usually have to send a secret token, normally called an access token, with your request in order to fetch data, and it's pretty easy to accidentally share these tokens with the public, which is definitely something you don't want to do. In this video, I will teach you why sharing these tokens is a bad idea in the first place, a high-level understanding of how you can secure them, and then using a few examples, I'll show you how you can use a service called Netlify Functions, which is a completely free option to secure your secrets without needing to write any backend code at all, at least not in the classical sense of backend. So why is sharing your API keys a bad idea? Well, for pet projects or little apps like this weather app here, which is a pretty popular portfolio piece, especially for people following the free code camp curriculum to put on their portfolio, it might not seem like too big of a deal. Most of the time for small apps like this, you're using free APIs, and the odds of someone actually going out of their way to go find your keys or secrets are pretty low. Still though, it's not going to make a great impression on employers or hiring managers if they're looking through your projects and they see that you missed this detail. The other thing is that even though it doesn't seem like a big deal because the APIs you're using are free, if someone gets a hold of those keys, it's very easy for them to max out your free plan, which will make your app look broken the next time a potential employer goes to review it. Here's a quick example of what someone could do. I have here in front of me a very simple weather app that makes a single API call to a service I have an account with. I'm not really a designer, but I wanted something that looked nice, so I went and found this on CodePen. So here's a quick mention to Colin Espenez, who has a lot of cool designs on CodePen that you should go check out, and maybe give some of his work a like. All I did to this app was plug in a bit of real data. You can probably figure out which bits are still hard-coded if you pay close enough attention, but the more important point I want to illustrate is that I didn't hide the API key associated with my account properly. So I'm just going to press F12 to open up my DevTools, and I just want to keep this network tab open, and I'm going to refresh the page just so you can see what I'm talking about. And if I expand this a little bit, you'll be able to see the names of some of these requests. And specifically, I'm interested in this one here. So this is the request that goes out when I'm talking to weatherstack.com, which is the API that I use to pull weather data into this app. And you can see one of the things that I have to pass this API is something called an access key, or my API key. And because this is just hard-coded in my app, anybody who visits this app can actually grab this key and use it for whatever purpose that they want. So just to demonstrate how easy it is to grab this, I'm just going to scroll to the bottom. It's a little easier to kind of grab the key out of the query string parameters. And now that I have that in my clipboard, I'm just going to jump over to this script in VS Code and just paste it here. So now I have a for loop that's just going to send a GET request to this API and just pass that API key that I stole from the query parameters when I loaded the app. And now I can just go into my terminal and I can just run this script, which pings the API 4 times. And you can imagine if I'm not your friend, maybe I just, instead of setting this to 4, set it to a few more than that. And obviously that's going to be a little bit of a problem because that free API that you're using isn't going to let you make requests anymore. And if you're using this app on your portfolio and expecting someone to go to it and hire you, they might be disappointed to see a broken application. Okay, so now we understand why sharing our API secrets and tokens is a bad idea. And I should mention before we move on, and hopefully I don't have to say this, but in a real production application where your app is being used by real customers, obviously the stakes are a lot higher. So we really want to secure these tokens. So Now let's understand the mechanics of how we actually secure these guys. In order to understand how to secure any sensitive information in your web apps, you really have to understand how requests and responses work. This isn't a deep dive into networking or anything, but you do need to understand at a high level how information living on your server makes it to the browser and what information is public to your users who visit your app or your website. It goes like this. A user types the name of your website into the address bar of their browser and clicks go. The browser creates an HTTP request and sends it off into the internet, this big cloud here, and eventually it finds its way to the web server that your application or your website is running on. In this case, by server, I mean physical computer, virtual machine, possibly a Docker container, really just any representation of what you can think of as a physical computer occupying real space somewhere in the world. And if there is no backend code, there won't be an actual application running on the server per se, but there will be a web server software such as Apache, Nginx, or something else like that. That server software will find the appropriate file to fulfill the request from the user's browser. In this case, the file will be this index.html file. The file is sent over to the browser as an HTTP response. Once it arrives, the browser is going to start parsing the HTML. Once it starts parsing the HTML, it's going to come across lines like this link tag or the script tag pointing to your CSS and your JavaScript files. And of course, when the browser comes across that link tag pointing to your CSS, it's going to send another HTTP request out into the cloud, eventually into your web server, asking for that styles.css file, which your server is going to return back as an HTTP response. And after the CSS comes back, it's going to hit that script tag and create a request that goes back to the web server, asking for that JavaScript file, and the server returns that JavaScript file as a response. And now the HTML, CSS, and the JavaScript are all living on your user's browser, on your user's computer, and it's time for that JavaScript to create the API call out to the weather API. And remember earlier we were talking about how this API needs to have an access token. Well, in this example, maybe that access token is actually inside the index.js file, something like this. Maybe it's ABC123. Well, that access token has actually been sent from the server when it passed the JavaScript file to the user's browser, and it's sitting right here in their computer's memory. And just like you saw before, when that request goes out to the weather API to fetch the data to populate that beautiful weather app, that access token's right here. And if this user's nefarious, as you saw in my demonstration before, he could do some bad things with that access token. Okay, so how do we fix that? Well, let's back up a little bit. So the user opens up their web browser, puts in your website, and we do the whole back and forth thing, get the HTML and the JavaScript and the CSS and everything. So HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. Now, what if that access token didn't actually live in the same file that we passed to the web browser, but instead it lived somewhere more secure on the server? This can be stored on some flat file, often called a env file, that'll have all sorts of environment variables, including an access token for the API. Now, let's also say maybe your server has another JavaScript file that's never intended to be returned back to the browser. In fact, the public can't access it at all, and it executes on the server. Maybe we'll call this one app.js. And app.js is written in a way to take requests from your front-end application, the JavaScript that sits in the browser over here, and make calls out to the weather API on behalf of your front-end application. So once the JavaScript's running over here in the browser, instead of sending a request out to that weather API, it instead sends a request back to your web server, which handles that request and executes that app.js file. And this app.js file can read this access token here, which is sitting in some environment variable maybe. And now it's app.js that makes that request out to the weather API. And the weather API returns that data back. And app.js through your web server now takes that data and returns it back to the browser as HTTP response. And so the user is never able to get access to the API key or the access token because it's sitting secure in your server. So this can seem like a bit of a bummer if you're used to hosting static sites, because there are a lot of great options out there for hosting static sites or any sort of front-end application that doesn't require a backend, and they're all free. One of those options is called Netlify, and I actually have a video explaining how to host a site or application with them. Link will be in the description. So now it seems like just because you need to fetch data from some API, now all of a sudden you need to build a backend for your app. And this can be a bit of a pain, especially if you haven't learned a backend language yet, but also the free options for hosting backend applications aren't as awesome as the options for front-end apps. So you'll probably end up spending at least a few dollars a month, even for a cheap server. And this is where Netlify Functions come into play. It's a service that allows you to achieve the architecture we just discussed, but without having to build an entire backend or having to think about renting or purchasing a server for that backend code to run on. It's built on a concept called serverless functions, specifically AWS Lambda, which is one offering among many that handles running serverless functions. I'm not going to dive into too much detail about serverless here, because I think the point of Netlify Functions is to hide all the complexity, and the point of this video is to not overwhelm people who don't have any exposure to this serverless world. There's a lot of stuff you need to know about configuring gateways, bundling modules, and other things when you work with AWS Lambda directly, but Netlify just takes care of it all for you, and you don't even have to think about it or understand how it works behind the scenes. And this is why I think it's such a great tool to learn how to use if you're just focused on front-end development. It opens up a whole world of functionality that would normally require a backend without needing a backend. So now that we understand the mechanics of securing API secrets and tokens, let's look at some practical examples of how we secure them using Netlify Functions. So let's finally open up our code editors and make an app. Now, when I'm learning something new, I like to remove as many things out of the equation as possible, so I can focus in on just the thing I'm learning. So that's why for this first example, I'm not going to be setting up React or Vue or anything. I'm also not going to worry about what the app actually looks like at all. I'm going to start super simple and get one thing working. I want to fetch data from a weather API using a Netlify function. For starters, I want an HTML file where JavaScript code will live, and bring in a couple dependencies for serving this little app we're building. So I'll create our index.html file, and that's just going to live inside of source. And HTML:5 in VS Code lets you press tab, and that just scaffolds out a little bit of HTML for us. And then I want to bring in two packages. So one is called HTTP server, and the other is called concurrently. And these are going to be dev dependencies. So I'll do the -d flag. And now in our package.json file, we should see those as dev dependencies. And now I'm going to add a script. Scripts. And this is just going to be called dev. And I'll explain why we brought concurrently in just a minute, but for now, we can just add our HTTP server command. That's going to be serving out of source, and the port can be, we'll just say 8080. So now if I jump back into that index file and I just put a little hello world here, and then we can jump into our terminal here and we can run the command yarn dev, or if you're using npm, just npm run dev. And HTTP server is gonna start a little server for us on port 8080, and I can just control click this. And that will open the web browser for me and we'll see our hello world. And now we want to set up our Netlify function. So just so that you know, the documentation around functions can be found on the Netlify site by clicking docs and then going down to functions here. Now what we're going to use to set up Netlify functions in our local development environment is something called the Netlify CLI. And most people will just go ahead and install that command globally, but I like to have these things installed per project just so that the version stays consistent. So back into the code editor and into my terminal, I'm just going to Control C to quit the server for now. And I will add the Netlify CLI as a dev dependency. So the next step is going to be to create a Netlify function. And the way we do that is we just add files inside of a functions directory. And the place that you're going to learn that is by going to the docs, clicking on functions, and then just clicking build with JavaScript down here. Now you can configure custom directories for your functions to live in like this, but we're just going to stick with the default. Now the Netlify CLI has a few commands that make development a little bit nicer. So that's one reason why you might want to install it globally with this command. And if you did install it globally, you'll be able to run Netlify CLI commands by typing Netlify and then the name of the command. Now, if you install Netlify CLI as a dev dependency like I did, there's a couple ways that you could run commands. So one, you can type the command out like this, and if you have nice auto completion in your terminal, it might not be that big of a deal. And the other option is to just add to your scripts a Netlify command, just like this. And so now I can run yarn Netlify. Or if you're using npm, then it's just npm run. So one Netlify command that we want to use is the functions create command. And that takes a name argument and the name of the function that you want to create. In our case, we're just going to call it fetch weather. And this command won't work yet because we haven't set up our Netlify toml. And of course, you can learn all about Netlify toml files from the documentation. So if you go to the Netlify docs, just click on configure builds and then file-based configuration. But for now though, all you need to know is that it's just a file that lives in the root of your project's directory. It's called netlify.toml. And this is just where you set up any configuration for your Netlify site. So we're going to add a build context, and we're just going to tell Netlify where our functions live. And to do that, we just type functions, and we give it a directory. In this case, just functions. And we'll come back to this file in a little bit, but for now, this is all we need. So back into the terminal, and we'll run that Netlify function create command that we ran earlier, which didn't work because I forgot to put the S right here. So let's just try that one more time. From here, you see a bunch of options to scaffold out a starting place for your function. And this is a great way to learn about all the different things you can use Netlify Functions for. We'll just do the hello world. And now you can see Netlify created a directory for us called Functions. And in here we have our fetch weather.js. So let's open that up. So let's take a look at what we have. So we have here a function that's called handler. And this is expected to be in every Netlify function that you create. And Netlify just wants to see that this handler function is exported. The other thing to point out here too is if you're coming from a front-end background and you haven't written any Node.js before, it's important to know that the runtime context that these functions are executing in is a Node.js environment. So for the most part, everything is going to be the same as what you're used to writing JavaScript in the front end. But one difference is the way we export modules is just slightly different. So if you haven't seen this before, that's likely why. The other key difference is obviously you won't have access to things that you normally can do in the browser, such as manipulate the DOM and a few other slight differences. But for the most part, it's just JavaScript. So you shouldn't notice too many differences. Let's scroll back to the top. And I'll just walk through what this function is doing quick. So the first thing is that this function takes an event, and on that event is where things like the query string parameters will live. So we're just expecting a parameter called name, and if it's not there, we'll default this subject to world. And then we're going to return an object that has a status code of 200, and then we're just JSON stringifying an object that has a message, and the message is going to be hello, whatever the subject is. And if anything goes wrong, we catch and we return a 500 status code. So the way this function actually gets executed is by hitting a endpoint or a URL that Netlify is going to provide for us. Basically what will happen is whatever our site domain name is, let's say localhost 8080, there'll be a route at /.netlify, and then whatever we configured our functions directory to be, so in this case functions, and then / the name of your serverless function. Okay, so let's make that request. I'm just gonna close a few of these files. And I'm just going to remove that hello world. And let's add a script tag to our HTML. And now I want to send an HTTP GET request to that Netlify function. And so that's going to live at .netlify/functions. And then whatever we called the function, which in this case is fetch-weather. And this also takes query string parameters called name. And this will return a promise. So I'll just take that response and we'll just console log the response JSON. And now if I run this, it shouldn't work yet. So we'll yarn dev, start our HTTP server. And if I open the dev tools and check this network tab, and I'll just refresh. Of course, we're getting a 404. And that's just because we're not running the Netlify Dev Server. The simplest way to do that is to use the Netlify Dev command. And it just needs to know one more thing. So in our Netlify toml file, we need to tell it where our functions is, which we're already doing. You also need to tell it where your published website is, or where your static build files. In our case, because we don't have a build step, it's just going to be source. And if you have Netlify installed globally, you can just run Netlify Dev. And if it's installed in your project and you added the script like we did earlier, then yarn Netlify Dev. And so now what has happened is Netlify found our functions directory, bundled those functions, and then created a function server and a port where those functions are listening on. We don't have to worry about that. We just need to worry about this other server that Netlify set up for us, which is where we can visit our web app. And if you wait a few seconds, it should just open up automatically in your browser for you. If not, you can control click the link. So now instead of running our app over the HTTP server command, this is actually running on a port given to us by Netlify Dev. I'm going to open up the developer tools again. Hit refresh so I can see network activity. And look at that. We got a 200. And when I click on the response tab, you can see that the message is hello, and then whatever the name of that query parameter was, which I hard-coded as Bob. So let's just walk through really quick what actually happened there, and then we'll wire up the real API inside of this function. So we made that HTTP request, and remember it had the at the end of the HTTP request we had the name parameter, which we just set to Bob. So that Netlify handles passing the event object through, which you can read the documentation to find out everything that's on that event. But one of the important things is it has this query string parameters attribute. And that's where whatever you pass as a query string parameter is going to be accessible here. So we could have had other query string parameters too, like maybe there was last name. And then you'd be able to access last name just like this. And that's important to remember how to do, because most of the time you're going to want to be able to pass some data to your Netlify function. Now for the API that we're about to work with, which is the weatherstack.com API, the query parameters we're going to need is going to be an access key, which we're going to look at how to securely add that parameter. We're going to need a query, and that's just going to take a some latitude and a longitude just separated by commas like this. And it also takes a forecast days amount. So for the purposes of this app, I'm just going to leave this hard-coded when we wire this up for real. We will take latitude and longitude as query parameters, and then the access key is going to come from an environment variable, which I'm also going to show you how to do. So yeah, let's build the real thing. So I'm just going to remove all of this. And the first thing that we're going to want to grab is the latitude and longitude. I'll just say lat and long, and that's going to come off the event. We want the query string parameters. I'm also going to want to pull the API secret out of an env file, but for now, I'll just hard code it here before I show you guys how to do environment variables in case you don't already know. So I happen to already have API secret, and feel free to try that if you want. It won't work by the time you watch this video. And real quick, I assume most of you probably already know how to get the access key for the API that you're using if you're watching this video, but just for completeness, if you're using the weatherstack.com API like I am, once you log in, you're just going to see it in your main dashboard right here. So back into the code, let's get rid of these silly semicolons. And I always like to build up my URL as a separate variable. And we'll use a template string here. So And this URL is just coming from reading the weather stack documentation, and that's going to take the access key and our query, which will be lat, comma, and then long. And then the last piece would actually be adding the forecast days, which reading through the documentation, I realized it's actually just an optional parameter, but we'll throw it in there anyway. Now I'm going to bring in Axios to make the HTTP call. So yarn add Axios. Then I'm just going to clean up these comments. And we want to require Axios. And speaking of dependencies, I'm going to jump over here real quick. So the problem with building these 30-minute plus YouTube videos is sometimes the content gets a little disjointed. So in the beginning of the video, I realized I said I was going to make use of this concurrently package, but we're not going to use it. So you can just actually remove concurrently and HTTP server if you want, since we're serving everything from the Netlify CLI. So that's just done like this. Oh, and I forgot the E. And if you're using npm, then the command is just going to be npm uninstall. Okay, back to the script. So now I want to make the get request out to the WeatherStack API, and I just want to wrap that in a try catch statement. That way, if an error does happen for any reason, our front-end application would be able to handle that error in a more user-friendly way. So I'm just going to pull a few things off the Axios error response, which is status text, headers, and the data. And that'll come off the error response. And then we'll just return an object with a status code. And actually, if I rename this to... Actually, you know what? Let's just call it status, and then I can do it like this, the shorthand. Okay, and then the body is just going to be JSON stringified our status text, headers, data. So now we want to make the Axios request. So I'm going to grab the data out of that response, and because we're inside of an async function, it's okay for me to just use await instead of using the promise API here. And we'll just pass the URL. Oh, and I'm missing the equal. Get rid of that semicolon. Now inside our try, we want to return that data back. So I'm going to do a status of 200. And we'll do a body, which will be JSON stringify, and we'll just stringify the data. And I stopped the Netlify Dev Server off camera, so let's just boot that back up. Okay, so now that's running, and we need to go back into our code editor and go to our index.html where we're making this fetch call. And we need to update the query parameters here, which is now going to be lat. Which we're going to populate that variable in just a second. And the second is going to be Actually, I forget what we called it. Long. And so the way that we get the latitude and longitude is from the geolocation API. And this is just vanilla JavaScript when you're running it in the browser. So navigator dot geolocation, and it's get current position, which takes a callback function. And that callback function is going to expect takes a position. And we can move our fetch up inside this callback. And to get lat and long, I can deconstruct those from the position dot chords. So let's see what we got. So back into the browser, F12 to open up the dev tools and just make sure I have the network tab selected. And I'll just refresh. Oh, and it looks like we have undefined, and I'm pretty sure I know why that's happening. So back into that index.html, the variables that come back from chords actually aren't called lat and long, so I can just alias these to latitude and longitude, and refresh the browser. And that looks like we're getting a 500 in the backend, or rather in our Netlify function. So if I look at the Netlify function and we look at the Netlify Dev Server, so I'm actually already seeing a couple of things. The first is Netlify expects the object that gets returned to have a status code key. So what I was doing down here actually doesn't work. And let's just go back into the browser and see what happens. Refresh. Hey, so now we do get a 200. But yeah, I suspected that we were going to have a... You know what? This isn't what I expected to see. I would have expected this to come from the catch in our try catch, but actually I forgot the weather stack API. I think technically still returns a 200, but then it returns this response that has a success false with an error code. So we'd have to handle that differently if we wanted to. For now, it's not a big deal. You can see the error is that the access key is missing, and I did notice that there is some typos in our URL, so let's go back and fix that. So there's two things that are wrong. The first is I did notice I have a typo on current. So that wouldn't have even worked if the access key had been passed properly, and it's not being passed properly because I forgot the equal sign here. So make sure that when you are passing query parameters that you always have the equal sign to assign what the value is. Let's go back into the browser again and refresh. And it looks like we still have an issue with our API request. And this is actually a good opportunity to show you how to set up the VS Code debugger, which is not super straightforward for Netlify Functions. So what you'll want to do in your project is add this directory .vscode if you haven't already. And you'll want a file called launch.json. And I'll have a link to this repository as well as a snippet on GitHub in the description below so that you can just copy and paste this code. But basically you want your launch.json file to look exactly like this. And the other thing you'll need to do is in your package.json is add a new script. Just call it debug, and it'll be Netlify Dev Inspect. And actually it's just occurring to me, I don't think if you use yarn, I'm pretty sure you can delete this line in your script file. And since we're not using this anymore, we can delete that too. Let me just double check. Yarn Netlify Dev. And yeah, it still works. So now that you have this debug script set up in your package.json and you have this launch.json in the .vscode directory, you should be able to go to the debug menu here on the side. and you'll have this Netlify debugging option, and you can just click Start Debugging. Now this is basically going to run a new Netlify Dev Server, and it's going to open up a new browser window. And it may take about a minute, so just give it some time. And once it's ready, it should automatically open up a tab in your browser with a new port on localhost, and you'll have to allow the location. And from here, we can go back into VS Code and just go to your fetch weather.js again. And you can move this guy around if you need to. So let's just put a breakpoint right here on line 4. And let's just see what's going on. So to get this function to run and actually hit the breakpoint, we just go back into the browser. You can click refresh. And if you go back into VS Code, you should notice that there's this yellow highlighted line wherever you put your breakpoint. Okay, so I'm just gonna step over to the next line. So we pulled lat, long should still be undefined. We'll step over. And it looks like long is undefined. So I guess when we hit the WeatherStack API, we're actually just not passing long. So that means that we're not getting it out of the query parameters. So if I go back over to index.html and I just take a look at what we're doing here. Oh, and it does look like I forgot to type the name of the query parameter. So I need to type the word long, equal, and then whatever the value of that longitude is. And I'll just save. And from here, I can just stop debugging by clicking the stop button here. And now that I'm back in the browser, I'm just going to close this debugging tab and go back into the normal Netlify Dev tab and just click refresh. And I still have the network tab running here. I'm just going to clear this just so it's a little easier to see. And let's see what we got. Hey! Awesome, so it looks like we actually got data back from the API. And you can see because I'm passing some longitude, latitude information from the geolocation API, it's actually picking up somewhat close to where I am. Okay, so that's awesome. We have data coming in from the weather API, and it's secure at least from the perspective of the web browser. You'll notice there's no way I can find what that API key was because the endpoint is just this Netlify function, which just takes a Latin long. There is still one security problem though, and you might remember from earlier I mentioned something about environment variables. So let's just take a look at that real quick. If you look back at that Netlify function, that fetchweather.js, the API secret's just hard-coded here. And the reason that's a problem is that means that this key or this secret is actually getting checked into version control, even though this isn't a Git repository right now. Eventually, I would want to host this somewhere like Bitbucket or GitHub, and it's just generally considered bad practice to have secret tokens and API keys and things like that just sitting in your code repository. So the way we normally get around that is with something called environment variables. Since this is a Netlify function, we're actually running Node.js, and Node.js has a way of grabbing environment variables called process.env. And it looks like this. So this is just expecting that there should be an environment variable on the system called API secret. And whatever that value is, I'm storing in this const. So the most common way to set environment variables in Node applications is using something called a .env file. So just go to your file explorer, create a new file, call it .env, and we'll just add a environment variable called API secret, and that will be equal to the API key. And the way that we prevent this from getting checked into our Git repository is we usually have a .gitignore file. And this is where node modules normally goes because we don't want to check that in, but it's also where we'll put our .env. Sometimes you'll see people put things like .vscode in here as well, although it's normally best practice to put that in a global .gitignore, but for now we'll just put it here. And then I'm just gonna initialize this repository just so you guys can see what I'm talking about. So I'll just type git init. And now you can see VS Code is grayed out, Node Modules is grayed out, and our .env file is grayed out. And if I click the Git icon in the side here, none of the changes that Git knows about are any of these directories or files that we have in our git ignore. And I'm not going to worry about committing this just yet. So the way that you would normally set up a project like this is you would actually have a copy of your env. I'll just paste that here and I'll rename this to .env.example. And since this is the file that gets checked into version control, I'm just going to delete the API key. And this just makes it so that when you or any other developer checks out this code later, you know about all the environment variables that have to be configured. Since in a typical application, there's usually going to be a lot more of these. So I can close this terminal now. And anytime that you edit this .env file, you will have to quit the Netlify Dev Server, so Control-C, and just rerun Netlify Dev. Okay, so let's just double check that the data is coming through. I'm just going to hit F12 again to open up the Dev Tools, click the Network tab, and then I'm going to click Refresh. And if I click here, and you can see we still have data coming through. And going back to that fetch weather.js file, you can see I don't have the API secret anywhere in the source code anymore. And it will never get checked into Git since it exists in this .env file that only exists on my computer, which means as long as I'm responsible with it, nobody's going to get access to this token. So if we go back to that first diagram that we had open at the beginning, Netlify Dev allowed us to simulate that last scenario that we talked about. So just to recap, we have our user interacting with the browser that types in a URL, and in our local development environment, that happens to be, localhost port, 8888 or whatever. And then that's going to send a request out to, again, in our local dev environment, it's our Netlify Dev Server, which then returns back our HTML, which happens to also include our JavaScript because we're inlining it. And then that's going to send a request to the server at localhost / it would be .netlify / fetch weather. So that request goes out. Netlify Dev Server catches it. And then that fetch weather function is bundled and living on that Netlify Dev Server, which the Netlify Dev Server handles creating an event with things like our query parameters attached to, and it passes that off into that function. And that's going to need the API key or the API secret. The place where that lives is that .env file that we created. And when you spin up the Netlify Dev Server, the API secret variable that we set in the env file, it gets loaded as an environment variable on the server. So the fetch weather script is pulling that environment variable value into that API call, which then gets sent out to the weather API, which then, assuming you spell all the parameters in your URL correctly, it'll return a successful response with some data. Then the function has to return that status code and the body back to technically the Netlify Dev Server. And then Netlify Dev handles returning that response back to the browser. So even though this is simulated all locally on your dev machine, this is essentially exactly what happens when you deploy your application or your website for real on Netlify. The only difference is that when you deploy live on Netlify, you're not going to have this flat .env file, or at least you won't have access to one. Now, there's a couple of ways that you can set environment variables in Netlify. I'm just going to show you one way, but in order to show you, I'll have to deploy this thing for real. So let's do that. Okay, so to deploy this app to Netlify, the first thing we'll want to do is create a Git repository. So I'm just going to close the Netlify Dev Server since we don't need it anymore. I'm going to click the Git icon. And I'll just say initial commit. If you hit Control-Shift-P or Command-Shift-P if you're on Mac, you can start typing publish to GitHub and just click this command. And if you haven't authenticated with GitHub already, it's going to walk you through how to do that. It's pretty straightforward. And if you've already done it, then you can just click public or private repository. I'm going to do a public repository in this case so that you guys can see the code after. Now, once that's uploaded, you can click here to see it in GitHub. In my case, I'm just going to head over to netlify.com. And once I'm logged in, I'm just going to click New Site from Git. I'm going to click GitHub. Again, if you haven't already, you will have to authenticate with GitHub. Again, that's pretty straightforward. And I'm just going to search for that how to hide API keys with Netlify Functions repository and click on that. The branch that I want to deploy is master. There is no build command in this case, and the published directory is going to be source, and it's actually just pulling that in from that Netlify toml that we set up. And if we want from here, we can go into the advanced build settings and start adding variables. But I'm not going to do that because I'm going to show you in the UI where you can add these after you've already deployed your site. So just click deploy site. Now, while that's getting ready to deploy, we can just go over to site settings, build and deploy. And if you scroll down here, you'll see this environment variables section. So just click edit variables. And we want one called API secret. And the value will be your API key. And click save. Now, if I go back to the top and I click site overview, we should see that the deployment is finished and we should be able to view this app by clicking the link here. I'm going to allow the location and we'll just open up the DevTools again, go to the network tab, refresh. And if I click on this, oh, it looks like something actually went wrong, invalid access key. That's probably because we just need to rebuild because we added the environment variable too late. So back into Netlify, go to deploys, and you can just trigger a new deploy. Okay, so once that's done, you can click preview. We'll allow, open the DevTools, back in the network tab, refresh again. And there we go. This time we're getting data. Okay, so let's review. So we learned why sharing API secrets or tokens is a bad idea, which I think is important to understand if you're just a new developer who's trying to create small apps to build up a portfolio, because you might not have thought it was such a big deal. But the problem is if somebody does get a hold of that secret, they can easily blow up that free API that you're probably using. In some cases, actually cost you money, or in more subtle cases, if there's no credit card involved, it will just max out the amount of requests that you're allowed per month. And that's a problem if someone's thinking about whether or not they want to hire you and they go and look at one of those portfolios and it's just broken. Then we went over the mechanics of how we secure that token. And there's two main things that we need to accomplish. So the first one was making sure that that token does not live in the browser ever. And the way that we accomplish that is instead of making HTTP requests out to our third-party APIs directly from our front-end application, instead we send those requests into a custom API or a custom endpoint that's running on our backend, a backend that we control. In this case, Netlify Functions. which is not really a backend, but a serverless offering. And then it's a responsibility of that serverless function or that backend to then make the call to the API, handle whatever data comes back, and return that data to our front end application. Following this pattern, there's just no way for the API token to end up on the browser, so long as you don't have it hard-coded in any of the JavaScript files that you send over the wire. And the second point to remember was that even if that token or that secret doesn't live in any of the JavaScript files that you send over into the browser, you still don't want them living in your backend code either. The problem with having the token in your code at all is that it will get checked into your Git repository and eventually uploaded to Bitbucket, GitLab, or GitHub, or wherever your host provider is. And then anyone with access to the repository is also going to have access to every single secret or API token that you have. So the way we get around that is, instead of hard coding those secrets in our code, we load them from environment variables instead. And those environment variables are set in either a flat file that never gets checked into version control, or in the case of Netlify, it's handled in the UI under environment variables. And then the last piece was looking at some practical examples of securing these secrets using Netlify functions. Now, this video ended up running way longer than I originally anticipated, so I'm calling it at one example. If you guys want to see more examples, just let me know in the comments below and I'll see what I can do. I'm still trying to figure out my teaching style and finding my own voice and just figuring out how I want these tutorials to be structured and how the overall flow is put together. So if you guys have any feedback at all for how I can improve on these videos, just let me know in the comments. I love hearing constructive feedback, and I always want to figure out how to improve. And I love hearing from you guys in general. It's motivating to see all the positive comments and feedback and all the love, and it really helps encourage me to keep doing these videos. So thanks for all the awesome comments, guys. And don't forget to like this video if you made it this far. Subscribe if you haven't already. And if you have any topics that you want me to cover in the future, also let me know. All right, I'll see you guys next time. Cheers.